Welcome back to the series on mapping the shadow. I want to introduce you to 3 new concepts relating to this model. I've touched on all of them at some point in this series so far, and as you can see, there's quite a lot in this model, so this series is ongoing. I've got many more episodes ahead that I could record at some point and will record most likely, and I've barely scratched the surface, in fact, in the first however many episodes it's been so far. We're getting into something quite core here, relating to the structure of the shadow map itself. So this episode I provisionally called Quality, Quantity, and Direction. 3 dimensions that we need to understand as we talk about the shadow map. These are 3 aspects of any form of energy, any movement of mind, any personality trait, any idea. It relates to these 3 aspects here: quality, quantity, and direction. Now, before I get into that, I want to tell a little anecdote of where this came from, because it's come from a number of places actually. There's something very essential about these 3 terms here. But I first heard them used in a business setting, because believe it or not, I actually used to work in sales, in business sales, which was an interesting experience. Certainly learned a great deal there. Had a lot of challenges, taught me a lot about modern workplaces, taught me a lot about the workings of the world and groups of people and organizations. And it wasn't training I'd had really until that point. So, I had to sort of learn quite a lot quite quickly. It wasn't something I was taught growing up. And what better way to understand it than to really get my hands dirty, as it were, and go and get involved in this kind of environment. So I, at the time, worked for quite a big organization with about 15,000 people. And so there's a lot of layers to the hierarchy. And I decided to reach out to someone who at the time was my boss's boss's boss, and managed to grab a precious 10 minutes with him. And he said to me, there's only 3 things you got to worry about or think about: quantity, quality, and direction. How much you're doing, how well you're doing it, and where you focus your energy. Now, I thought, cool, I like that. I like a model. I like the simplicity of it. I think I sensed there was something deeper to this than he was letting on or was even aware of himself. But I also thought, well, I like the fact that, well, quantity, I can control that. Like, I am in control of how much I do, how much I show up, how much I speak to people, and so on. Quality, how well I'm executing on those interactions, that will probably come as a natural consequence of just doing it, the practice. But where this really came into its own was this third piece, direction. And his key message to me really was not either of those 2 things. It was more focus on direction. Where are you actually focusing your energy? What are you choosing to apply yourself to? Are you willing to see things clearly? He didn't say it this way, but that's essentially what he was getting at. Are you willing to see each opportunity as it really is? In sales, they talk about qualification, understanding the opportunity deeply. There's various acronyms for helping you with this, like the scale, the size, the originality you bring versus the competition. The timeline, is there some kind of compelling event? Is it something your offering can actually match and deliver? And if you fail in any one of those areas, either by not qualifying, being in ignorance about it, or misleading and actually saying, oh yeah, we can do that, and actually you can't, and maybe because you're over-promising and under-delivering, or maybe because someone internally is feeding something to you that's not accurate, that's going to harm the deal, it's going to harm the relationship, it's going to harm a dialectic. It's not going to, in the near term, help you or anybody with your inner work process, with your self-knowledge process, until it crashes and burns, and then there's plenty to reflect on there. So this third piece, direction, there's a deeper esoteric significance to this as well. Because curiously, when we actually focus on the truth and the things that matter and allow ourselves to see things actually more clearly, guess what shows up? So, I find the corporate world very interesting in some ways, because it's a kind of what Hegel would call a bad infinity. It exists at this plateau where it doubles down on an idea of something, usually some kind of metric, profit or sales or whatever it might be, some kind of KPI, and does that at the expense of everything else that matters. So there's this resistance to growth and transformation that pretty much defines it. I mean, it doesn't transform largely. There's some organizations that do, but mostly it's more adaptation, not transformation. Very different thing. Transformation comes from empathy, comes from the bravery and the willingness to actually face tension and assimilate it, no matter what it's saying about you, no matter what it's saying about the real motive behind what you're doing, for example, no matter what it's saying about your own morality. And so I apply these terms in quite a different way to the model. I mean, it has an analogy, but it's not exactly the same. So I wanted to share that because that's where I actually got the terms from. But someone who described what these actually mean here in greater accuracy was Nikola Tesla. And he famously said that if you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. So what could this possibly mean? Think quantity, quality, and direction. Energy is like quantity. Energy can mean many things, but this is all about energy. But in his case here, think about the amplitude of what we're bringing forward. If we're bringing forward our persona, are we bringing it with such volume that it just tries to bulldoze over everything else? Have you ever been in that situation where maybe you showed up to a meeting or you showed up to some kind of event or function? Maybe you were feeling a little bit nervous or uncertain about something. And the response to that, rather than to dance with that uncertainty, embrace that friction and tension, is to just go in like a bull in the china shop and double down on how you want to be, grabbing onto some persona so tightly that it's almost like you're demanding that other people get with your program. And this might have all the appearances of smiles and friendliness and being very jovial and entertaining, and other people might reflect that back to us and laugh and nod their heads and engage with us in our gregariousness. But inside they're thinking, oh God, I can't wait to get away. So either we've been the perpetrator there, or we've witnessed other people doing it. And we've all done this in various flavors, in various ways, at various times. This is some example of this magnitude, going in with a very high quantity of this energy, whatever it is. So then quality, of course, is like the flavor that we show up as. This is implicit in everything I've been saying to this point in time in this series. Every one of these examples I've shared, whether it's kindness, whether it's efficiency, whether it's discipline, whether it's fairness, whether it's something like a tarot card, right? These are all like different qualities, different flavors, different modes, different formats of energy. Just like colors are different frequencies on the spectrum of visible light. Just like sounds are different frequencies of vibration, different notes. The note of C versus the note of G. These are different frequencies on a scale. There's a whole philosophy there to explore, like why music is the way it is, why we hear it the way it is. It has certain archetypal resonance as well. But you can think of these as frequencies or flavors or qualities. Also showing up, of course, as traits. A few episodes ago, I talked about the INFJ personality type, that is. If you're not familiar with this, this is simply someone who has a preference for intuition and feeling and how they make decisions. Specifically, introverted intuition and extroverted feeling. Each of those is a kind of quality. It's a kind of flavor. Completely distinct from the quantity. Completely distinct from the magnitude with which that flavor or that quality is brought forward. So back to Tesla's message here. thinking in terms of energy and frequency and vibration. So what is this third piece, vibration? Now, this is analogous to that direction I mentioned earlier in that piece of sales wisdom that was duly imparted to me. Direction. What are we doing here? What's the direction of our energy? Because there's a missing piece here. Just intuitively right now, can you sense what that missing piece is? Okay, we've talked about the magnitude, the volume or the amplitude, quantity, and we've talked about the quality, the flavor or the frequency, the specific format in which it shows up. What's this missing piece then? What's left out of this? Do you remember a couple of episodes ago I talked about the duality of duality, and I talked about intention? This is direction. Direction, intention, very similar thing. So if we look at the basic shadow map, this is implicit in what we see as the power position and the shadow position. You'll notice that we have these 5 areas here. We have 2 on the right in the conscious realm. We have 2 on the left in the shadow realm. And then we have the centrum, which is the self. It is both the initial implicit in itself form, like the egg or the seed from which both of these things come, but it's also the end as well. It's also what they come back to once reconciled. So then, what is the difference between the conscious thesis and the power position? It's not quality. This is precisely what unites them. They both have the same quality, kinda. There's a difference there, but broadly speaking, they have the same flavor. So what's the difference then? There's actually 2 differences between them. Let's take the example of efficiency again. Efficiency and ruthlessness, they have a similar flavor. Important caveat there, they're not quite the same because intention has a quality of its own. Quantity has a quality of its own. Now, I'm not normally one for quoting Stalin. I think it was him that said that. But there's a truth in that. And here we're also getting an idea of the holistic nature of this. These 3 dimensions themselves all actually relate to each other. There's a commonality between them. Energy is a kind of frequency, frequency is a kind of vibration, vibration is a kind of frequency and a kind of energy. So what is the difference then between efficiency and ruthlessness? In one sense, it's magnitude, it's quantity. Ruthlessness is a bit like efficiency taken to its extreme. It might be a mere image of efficiency that leaves out the deeper meaning of efficiency. It might be a caricature of efficiency, sort of refined in a bad way, refined in a negative sense, form of efficiency. Like you've taken the thing that appears to produce an effect, you've isolated it, you've cast out everything else, and doubled down on that process ad infinitum until what you've got is merely a ephemeral, impoverished casing, a wrapper. It's the packaging of efficiency. It's not the real thing. You've taken out the content, thrown it away, and kept the packaging. The packaging might have looked good when you were out there shopping and looking for something to take on board, but in the end, you threw away the wrong thing. You threw away the deeper essence. Now, there's nothing really wrong with ruthlessness in that sense because it's actually part of this whole process. And it helps us understand this element, this difference. What's the other reason that efficiency and ruthlessness can be different? This is direction. So just as you have a central point, you also have these 2 outer points that are known as the power position and the shadow position. Each of these is a kind of mini centrum that also has its own center of gravity. And it's always doing this to some extent. Like as this energy pathway moves, there's always a sort of sub-circumambulation that goes on. So not only are we also orbiting the self, but the idea of ourselves also has its own sort of sub-circumambulation going on. Just like the planets orbit the sun, the planets also have objects orbiting them, moons and other things. In a similar kind of way, the idea here has this secondary element. That in itself isn't a problem. The problem is when this energy is misdirected, when it's misused, when it is used only in service of itself, when it insists upon itself, and it denies the self, it denies the wider reality. This is the lack of empathy. This is the unwillingness to engage with what there is. It doesn't want to experience feeling. It doesn't want to lose hold of its certainty. It's not only uncomfortable in uncertainty, it doesn't only dislike uncertainty, it fears letting go of what it knows, of what is certain. And this can happen for a number of means. This can happen because the ego isn't strong enough, in a Jungian sense, to face and assimilate what it needs to assimilate. There's so much unresolved tension of feeling there that to even go near it just seems impossible. However, that's not the only condition here. There's another condition that's absolutely necessary for this to occur, and that is freedom. That is free will. Schelling was very clear about this and offered one of the most intricate and helpful philosophies around how this comes about. We all have freedom. We're all limited as well. And we're going to explore more about the relationship between freedom and limitation and responsibility. But for now, just know that the fact that we have freedom means we're also free to violate freedom. And it means we're free to choose not being free. Right? We're free to choose coping mechanisms. We're free to choose to avoid ourselves. And that's basically what's going on in this misdirected energy. It has its place. You couldn't have freedom without this phenomenon, without the ability to deny freedom. It wouldn't be freedom if you weren't free to deny it. However, at the same time, it's also true that there is something objectively unwholesome about this aspect. You see how subtle this becomes at some point. The understanding the duality of this very point, that there is both truth and untruth to both sides. There is truth in the fact that evil is done as a result of certain conditions that people didn't choose. They had a difficult childhood. Yes, that contributes to this. But there's also truth to the fact that it's done freely and it's chosen. And this is understandably an area that Western society does not understand well at this point in time. And in its place, it generally can only resort to one of two things. One side of an extreme, one side of a dichotomy. It can either become very, very powerful in a masculine sense and become very punishing and authoritarian. There's definitely a place for that, of course, right? I mean, one modern day example of this might be in El Salvador right now, where tens of thousands of people are locked up in very squalid, torturous conditions. Many of them very justifiably so, not the torturous part, but the imprisonment part. Yeah, you can understand why they might need to be locked away. Probably a very large number of them. But a lot of these guys, and a few girls too, were locked up pretty much just because they were wearing tattoos. And I've seen footage of police checking people for certain kinds of tattoos, which suggests that they are applying a bit of discernment there. It's just inevitable that in anything like this, there's going to be fallout, there's going to be collateral. And the El Salvadorian government actually makes that point themselves, that they look at like England or America and they say, well, do you not also lock up innocent people? There's always going to be collateral damage. True. But just so happens that they've provided a perfect example of what happens when you take a very, very extreme masculine approach to this particular issue. And most El Salvadorians are pretty behind this, it would seem. But there's also the occasional tragedy of someone who's had their son taken away and is adamant that their son had no involvement in anything. And there's also, like I say, there's daughters that have been caught up in this as well. So it's no perfect solution, clearly. But what happens when we consider the other side here? What might be a very feminized approach to a similar problem? Well, I think we can have a pretty good sense of that when we look at the West now, particularly Europe and its attitude to migration. So it's one thing to be passionate and want to help people in trouble. It's another thing to completely open your doors almost indiscriminately, or at least take no action against those who are entering illegally. And that produces its own kinds of problems. So sometimes I find this is exemplified by, the idea that, oh, so-and-so had a difficult childhood, as though there is no free will involved. And there's a great irony in materialism as well right now, which is having to resort to that very idea philosophically, that actually there is no free will. Oh, look, you can see it on brain scans. People decide before they know they decide. How is that not actually just evidence for the idealist point of view around the unconscious and its influence? So you can interpret that very piece of evidence in a number of different ways. And so this idea of determinism, which you can understand why that might be very attractive in a lot of ways, because if I don't have free will, then necessarily I don't have responsibility either. And responsibility is virtually by definition the most challenging thing, because it is the way that we negate the negation of freedom. It is the way that we account for freedom and transmute freedom into growth. Because it's one thing to just go around willy-nilly causing chaos and pursuing every impulse, but that kind of so-called freedom very quickly becomes just another form of slavery. And it's through responsibility that we actually transmute that into true self-knowledge. So this idea of direction is vital, and there's a lot of work to be done in cultural understanding of this. There's a lot more philosophy I think we need around this, and it's good enough just to go back and read the guys I've been talking about. Go read Hegel, go read Schelling, go read Fichte. There's so much just in what those guys have written that can elucidate this particular issue. I'm not for a second thinking that this is going to become like bedtime reading for most people, or something they start teaching in schools. But if the ideas behind it can be made accessible without sacrificing too much, and at least integrated into cultural understanding, that there is such a thing as freedom and that it matters. And I mean, many would argue that we already understand that to a large degree. That's why we have the legal system. That's why it works the way it does. It has to recognize the free will that's involved. Well, there's truth to that and there's value to that. But there's two things I would say to that. The first is that, well, clearly, as I just said, there is a overt philosophical movement that tries to deny freedom and explicitly makes the case that everything from theft to rudeness to serial murder is just the problem, or just the result of a broken brain, something going wrong in the brain. This is something that's actually being put forward on spurious philosophical grounds that doesn't take any account of any of these idealist thinkers. It's a natural extrapolation of materialism, but has very quickly become self-contradictory. So it's already on shaky ground there. The second response to that I would make is that I would caution against thinking that the understanding of freedom is as integrated into modern culture as one might think or like to think. Personally, I think it hasn't barely begun to understand the nature and the profundity of freedom, and what freedom really is, and how it really works, and what it means for us. And when we really understand that, and we understand the difference between what is merely something we don't like, something we find displeasing in someone else because of our own shadow map, our own shadow material, versus what is a genuine violation of freedom, what is a genuine misuse and misdirection of energy, that's where the crux of shadow work is. It's really being able to piece those apart. There's a theme here around morality, and that you cannot really meaningfully talk about shadow without talking about morality. I mean, you can talk about the difference of these theses here. You can talk about opposite flavors and qualities. But unless you bring on board this moral element of what that really means, you'd always be clutching at something. There'd always be something missing. I mean, there'd always be something missing anyway. And there's going to be an ongoing journey here. It's a never-ending process. But it doesn't take us anywhere near far enough to just see it in terms of qualities and just paste over that with rose-tinted glasses. Yes, there is a higher perspective that views all of this as necessary and meaningful as part of the whole, as part of the absolute self, and as part of the dialectical process towards it. But to try and jump there, to sort of teleport there and say, oh, well, therefore, there's nothing wrong with theft or murder or gaslighting or narcissism or anything, is a bypass. It's actually partial, pretending to be impartial. It hasn't actually done the assimilation. It is necessary to see those things as they are, to make those discriminations with the mind. Not so much that you cut off the dialectical process and that you cut off empathy. Quite the opposite, actually. The denial of such things is the denial of empathy. The denial of such discriminations is the very judgment it ostensibly tries to escape from. There's no way around this. It's a process, and there's energy involved, and it has to be confronted. It's no use just to say, oh, well, forget it all now. The self is all there is. And no, we are particular. We are human. We have to walk this path. There's no way around it. And so understanding things in terms of direction, I find, can really improve one's understanding of shadow work. And so I'm going to end this session here on a quote by Woody Allen, who humorously said that 80% of success is just showing up. This reminds me of the quantity piece. If you just show up, then quality follows naturally, and eventually you'll figure out what direction really is. But unless you're showing up, then what are we talking about? So there's a kind of direction in that. The very willingness to show up itself is a kind of goodness. So there's so much more to be said in all of this, but we've reached the half an hour mark. So for now, well, thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.